so in this video, we're going to kind of continue to look at some of the other functions that Maya has for us. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about these buttons right here. Okay, so we've got an object right now in the middle of our viewport, right? And we're able to move around that object. We know that this is the single view. This is our perspective view, right? We know that we can get back and forth between quad and single view by either tapping the space bar or using the buttons. But how do we move objects around? So you can see right now we've got this little transform tool, as we'll call it, sitting on top of our object, or in the middle of our object. And what that will do is it will move our things around. Now, this is just one of these tools over here. So for example, you can see that this button is currently active, and it's this little square that's got 4 arrows on it, and that is your move tool. A good thing to remember here is you can also get to the move tool by pressing down the W key on the keyboard, right? So if I have, say, a different tool selected, if I've just got my selection tool here and I want to get to my move tool, I just hit W and it will automatically bring up the move tool. So what is the move tool? So the move tool is just this little thing that's allowing us to move the object around in one of our 3 axes, right? So 3-dimensional space, if you are sort of remembering this from your high school math class, is defined by 3 coordinates, right? We have an X coordinate, a Y coordinate, and a Z coordinate that defines an object's location in space, right? And now the easiest way to remember which of these is which is that RGB equals XYZ. So red equals X, green equals Y, and Z equals blue. Now you might not think that you're going to have to remember those, but you will, right? So just always focus in red X, green Y, blue Z. If you can remember RGB equals XYZ. And if I click on one of these arrows, I can move it in that direction. If I click on any of the other arrows, I can move it in that direction. If I click on one of the other arrows, I can move it in that direction, right? But you'll also notice that we've got this other little square thing that's located on the tool as well. So we've got this blue square here. What this is, for each of the directions, this allows you to move it in 2 axes at once, but not 3, right? So in other words, this square right here will move it in Y and X at the same time. This square will move it in Y and Z. So if I just click on that, you can see that it will sort of slide, right? It's not going to move it in X, just Y and Z. And then this one will only move it in Z and Y, but not X, right? That's a very useful thing. The one thing you probably want to never do with this tool is to click on the middle of the tool. The reason is it doesn't really work very well. This will move it in 3 axes at once, and this is almost always a mess because you don't know whether you're moving it towards you or away from you or left and right, and it's a recipe for disaster. So whatever you do for the move tool, never click on the middle of the tool. All right, so that's the move tool. So and by the way, all of these tools, you can dig into the tool by double clicking on the actual icon itself, and it will bring up the tool settings, which we'll talk about in a later video. But for now, just know that that's how you get to this stuff. All right, so let's look at the rotate tool. So that's right below here, and the keyboard shortcut for this is the E key on your keyboard. So exactly to the right of the W key, right? So they're located right next to one another. So E, W to get your move tool, E to get your rotate tool. And you'll see that for the rotate tool, we've got a slightly different looking thing. This is what is known as a gimbal. And a gimbal is a 3 axes rotation tool. So you can see we've got a circle around each of the axes, right? So think of it as like a wheel going around an axle. So the axle is the axis, right? And the wheel will kind of rotate it around that axis. So we know, for example, that our Y goes up and down, and you can see that our rotate Y rotates around the up and down axis. So it spins around that, right? This is our Z, and if we just grab onto this little line and left click and drag, we can rotate it. And same thing here on the left hand side. or excuse me, when we click on X, right? You don't really, just like with the move tool, you don't want to just click anywhere, because if you try to rotate this on 3 axes at once, it is a mess, and you will very quickly screw things up. So it's very important when you're moving, rotating, and scaling, which we'll learn about in a second, to move deliberately and carefully. So oftentimes the rotate tool is of limited use to us for kind of very precise things, but we'll talk about that later. So that's the rotate tool, and again, rotate tool, we can get to the settings on that by simply double clicking on it. Now the other really useful thing about the rotate tool is you can see here, and I'm going to open up this thing we haven't talked about yet called the channel box, which allows us to see exactly where we're moving and rotating. So you can kind of see here that as I rotate this, we get numbers that appear here on this side of the screen. And you'll notice that this number, this is how much I've just rotated it in Z. And that is negative 29.766 degrees. And, you know, not a very useful number. Usually if we want to be precise, it's better to use like whole numbers, right? So something like 15 degrees or negative 30 degrees. Oops, I just clicked on the wrong one. That's scale. We don't want to do that. So let's reset that one. And negative 30 there, right? But there is a shortcut. So if you don't want to punch in numbers here all the time, and you still want to use the rotate tool, all you've got to do is while you're rotating, or right before you rotate, hold down the J key and rotate, and you'll see that it will snap. In my case, it's not snapping, and that is because this is set up in my tool settings. So if you're not able to do this, there is one little button you can set up here. I'm going to turn this off. This is, I just went into my tool settings by double clicking on the rotate tool here, and I turned step snapping off. And now when I hold down the J key, that snaps. And you can see if you look at my channel box over there on the right that we're getting clean 15-degree snapped increments. And that is how you typically want to rotate things, because we get really precise, perfect alignment. And when we're modeling, perfect alignment is really important. Okay, so that's the rotate tool. Now, the last tool we're going to look at here is the scale tool. Scale tool is one of the most useful tools, I think, in the entire program, but it doesn't always appear this way at first, right? And we're going to get more into this, right? So right now, the scale tool can feel a little bit like lame compared to the rotate and move, but you'll see how useful it gets later on. So the scale tool, you can scale things up or down by simply grabbing onto one of these handles here, and I'm going to turn step snapping off for this one in my tool settings by double clicking on the tool, and so that way we'll get a little bit smoother scaling. And you can see here that as we scale, it's changing that number in the channel box there. And I can also grab one of my other handles and warp the object. Now this isn't typically something that you want to do. The way that you're actually going to use the scale tool is going to be once we start to move around parts of this object. If you do anything with the scale tool, typically you want to just scale it uniformly. And to do that, you grab the center of the tool and click and drag left or right, and that's just going to make the object bigger or smaller in general. That's kind of a nice, important tool to use. Okay, so that's the scale tool, that's the move tool, and the rotate tool. So now the other tools here are this is the selection tool. And there's different selection things that you can do. But the thing that you may have noticed already is that if I have multiple objects in my scene here, if I just get a box in here, and if I get let's get a cone in here, I guess, right, is that I can already click on things and I can select them, right? So if I click on the cone, it selects the cone. If I click on the box, it selects the box. If I click on this, so you don't always need to use the selection tool. The selection tool, the advantage of using that is that when I click on it, that's all it does. The danger is that if you use the move tool to select something, you may accidentally move it when you select it. And so you sort of have to be careful, but I tend to just use the move tool. I very rarely use the selection tool unless I'm trying to be very precise in the way that I'm selecting things. Okay, so let's keep moving here. So the other thing we didn't really talk about when we were talking about the viewport is that you'll notice that there are also these buttons on the top of the viewport. And these are going to be for looking at the object in different ways and lighting them in different ways. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we start to model. But just know that we've got a bunch of pull-down menus here at the top of the screen. And again, don't be too intimidated by these, because a lot of the pull-down menus here, just like the ones on the top of the screen, they represent things that are often done here in the buttons. And not all of them, obviously, but some of the buttons here are important. So probably the most important buttons that we will use right off the top of right off the bat are going to be things like wireframe, which allows you to see just the outlines of the object. To get away from that, you can go to smooth shade, which is right next to it. You could also, my favorite is wireframe unshaded, which is right here, and that allows you to see the outlines without having the object selected. That is incredibly useful. The other really useful function here is this thing called X-ray, which allows you to kind of see a semi-transparent version of the object. I like this a little bit better than wireframe. Wireframe is fully transparent with just the lines, but it can be hard to see what you're looking at with wireframe. So I like using X-ray a lot. And then finally, for this window here, we've got this pull-down menu that says Panels, and this allows you to dial in, views. So if I wanted to change this view, for example, to a side view, I could just go to Panels, Orthographic, and then Side. So if you're wondering what orthographic means, it means two-dimensional view, not three-dimensional, right? Okay. So we're back in perspective here, and that's just a useful thing. You'll probably struggle sometimes by losing your viewport or something like that, and just know that you can get back to it by using that. All right, so we've got a couple more functions to go over here. Perhaps the most useful of them all is going to be this thing right here called the outliner. And if you don't see this on your screen right now, make sure that this little button right here is clicked, this little spreadsheet looking or bullet point thing looking here. And what this is for those of you that have used Photoshop or Illustrator, it's a little bit like the layers menu, but it's quite different. In fact, the better way to think about this would be to think about it the way that you think about the File Explorer on your PC or the Finder on your Mac. So if I'm looking, for example, at this this is just a random folder from my computer right now, right? And we're very familiar with these at this point, right? If we've got a bunch of files here, but then we also have folders, right? And we have things that live inside of these folders. So just like my Maya projects folder here, and if I go into the scenes file, right, there's things inside of other things. So there's a hierarchy to this, right? So in other words, there's a top level, and you can dig in and you can go deeper in. And that's kind of the way that the outliner works. And we're going to learn a little bit more about this as we go on. But the short version of this, right, is that we can click on things in our scene. So we've got the cone, which is called pCone1. We've got our cube, which is called pCube1. P-cylinder, if you're wondering what the P stands for, it means poly, as in this is a polygonal cylinder. And wherever our sphere is, but we don't even need to know where that sphere is, but we could just delete it from there if we wanted to. This is just another way of selecting things. We can also rename these. So if I don't like the name P-cylinder, I can call this my cylinder, right, or something like that. And so you get the idea here. And we'll talk a little bit more about the outliner, but as we work more and more, this is going to be very important, and you always want to make sure that you're keeping this organized as we go. All right, so now let's pause the video here and let's move on, and we're going to talk about the final couple of elements of our interface.